The visions had returned. They haunted me. I couldn't eat. I could barely sleep. Everywhere I'd go, everything I'd do, strange symbols followed me. But what did they mean? In search of answers, I ventured out into the world. I journeyed far out into the wilderness, to unknown corners of the globe, in search of the truth. And when my quest felt like it had all been in vain, I looked up to the heavens to find a message written in the stars. I heeded its call and was rewarded with a guide. So I set upon my calculations, reaching into dark, forbidden knowledge, until finally, my mission was complete, creating the ultimate list of the 100 greatest films of all time. And here we are, my dark alchemy complete, ready to present to you the definitive 100 greatest films of all time. 2 years ago, I embarked on this mission to create a go-to top 100, combining popular sentiment with critical consensus to create an indisputable film canon. And I thought I had succeeded, but I was wrong. As it turns out, that old list was a false prophet, a messiah of lies which we must cast into the fires of hell where it belongs, so that a new list may rise from the ashes like a glorious phoenix! So I updated it. The original list consists of 4 lists which I combined together. The 2012 Sight and Sound Critics list, the top 100 films from Letterboxd, the top 100 from IMDb, and AFI's top 100 films. Now this is the first big change to the new list. AFI is no longer included. The list hasn't been updated since 2007, and it only includes American films, so it just didn't feel like it had a place on the new list. You should have updated your list. The new list is comprised of 7 individual lists, adding on the Sight and Sound Directors list, Metacritic, Rotten Tomatoes, and Empire. The entries on each list are weighted, with the top entry receiving 100 points, while the bottom entry receives 1 point. The lists themselves are weighted as well, with Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes receiving 12.5% of the value, Empire receiving 50%, IMDb and Letterboxd receiving 75%, while both of the Sight and Sound lists receive 100% of their value. With the methodology set, let's take a look at each of the lists, starting with Metacritic. Metacritic, like Rotten Tomatoes, is a review aggregate. It's assigning a score out of 100 to each of its films. The big difference is they are much more selective in their sources. Where a film on Rotten Tomatoes may have 400 critics contributing to it, that same film may only have 50 on Metacritic. The critics it uses tend to just be from major publications, which actually fall under the Top Critics banner on Rotten Tomatoes. The list itself has some interesting features, and the first I want to mention is its top film, The Godfather. The reason that's of note is that on the original list, The Godfather was the #1 film by a wide margin, without appearing as #1 on any of the individual lists. That's no longer the case. It features a good mix of classic and modern films, but the placement is often very surprising. For instance, the top 5 goes The Godfather, Citizen Kane, Rear Window, Casablanca, And then Richard Linklater's Boyhood. It also features a lot of classic Disney films. Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Dumbo all appear on the Metacritic Top 100. Its biggest issue is that some films simply don't have a Metacritic score, so they just can't be featured on the Top 100. I also want to mention the most featured director, Alfred Hitchcock, with 6 films featured on the Metacritic Top 100. Next up is Rotten Tomatoes. Now, the funny thing about the Rotten Tomatoes list is that it's not actually on the website anymore. They took it down unless something's changed very recently. But I wanted to include it on this list because of the impact that a Rotten Tomatoes score seems to have on the film culture and the success of a film. I had to use the Wayback Machine to find the last day it was available, which was sometime back in September. And it makes sense as to why they removed the list, because it was absolutely insane. One of the things the Rotten Tomatoes list did was weigh for the amount of reviews, so it skews fairly modern, but the algorithm was completely broken. Because if you were to guess for the amount of films released since 2015 that appear on the top 100, what would you say? 10? Maybe 15? It's 57. Over half of the films on the list were released in the last 8 years. But I'm actually okay that it skews so modern. I'm not giving them enough points to make or break the list, but it's enough to just maybe raise a modern film stock a little bit. But as modern as the list is, its #1 film? It happened one night. And its most featured director? Also Alfred Hitchcock, with 5 films. Which means that out of all the films made before 2015, over 10% of the best ones were made by Alfred Hitchcock. Next up is Empire. Their list was made via a reader's poll for 2022. Now, this has a smaller sample size than the other audience lists, but that also means it's less susceptible to manipulation. Looking at you, Dogswell. But it is very much a popular film list. Its #1 film? Fellowship of the Ring. Its #2 film, Empire Strikes Back. Its most featured director, Steven Spielberg. Of course it's Spielberg. You got your Marvel, your Batman, your Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, Terminator. Is there Bergman? Is there Godard? No, but there is Point Break, and who doesn't love a little Keanu Swayze sexual tension? Next up is IMDb. Now, the IMDb Top 250 for a long time was where you went to see what the people thought were the films worth watching. But with the rise of Letterboxd in recent years, IMDb has started to decline. For instance, Avatar: The Way of Water has over 600,000 logs over on Letterboxd, but at IMDb, only around 250,000. But it remains a bit of a counterbalance to Letterboxd, offering a different perspective. That perspective being extremely Gen X film bro. You got your Fincher, your Tarantino, you've got your American History X, your Leon the Professional, your Requiem for a Dream, and of course, your most featured director, Mr. Christopher Nolan. But while Nolan has 6 films in the top 100, his last 2 films have not made the top 250. We'll see if Oppenheimer changes that. But the #1 spot at IMDb, as it has been for years now, is of course... Shawshank Redemption. On to Letterboxd. With the site being more active, its list is much more mercurial. There's a lot more changes. Just this past year, its #1 film has changed from Parasite to Everything Everywhere All at Once to the current #1 film, Come and See. There's definitely an embrace of more art house fare than over at IMDb, and that can be seen in its most featured director, Ingmar Bergman, with 5 films. There's also a tendency in the community to really rally behind something hot that's in that art house vein, like what happened with Come and See. I'd be really surprised if we don't see Possession really shoot up that list now that it's on Shudder. On to the Sight and Sound list, starting with the critics. Now, there was a clear embrace of the experimental when it came to this list, and that is no exception when it comes to its #1 film. Wait just one second. Ugh. John Dielman. A choice that shook the film world to its very core. Beyond that, you've got Meshes of the Afternoon, News from Home, La Jetée, History du Cinema, Man with a Movie Camera. Just a lot of bold experimental filmmaking on display. You've of course got Jean-Luc Godard as one of your most featured directors, tied with the director of their former greatest film of all time, Alfred Hitchcock, with 4 films apiece. The director's list is very much cut from the same cloth, though not quite as far into the experimental as the critics' list, and that can be seen in its #1 film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It still falls under the challenging film banner, but certainly not to the degree that John Dielman does. For their most featured directors, there's actually a 3-way tie between Ingmar Bergman, Kurosawa, and Francis Ford Coppola. They included The Conversation, which came out the same year as The Godfather Part 2, and is often overlooked by audiences compared to the other 3 films that show up on these lists. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention before we move on, as it relates to the Sight and Sound list. Now, on both of those lists, they feature a lot of ties. Now, because this isn't the World Cup, and we're not playing soccer, I want to make it very clear that my list contains no ties! No ties! Ah! No ties! In total, there are 405 films across all the lists, and only 3 that appear on all 7 of the lists: The Godfather, Parasite, and Psycho. These are your gods now, worship them as such. An additional 5 films appear on 6 of the lists. That's Apocalypse Now, Citizen Kane, Rear Window, Singing in the Rain, and Seven Samurai. A total of 9 directors have at least 5 films across the list: Christopher Nolan, Billy Wilder, Quentin Tarantino, Martin Scorsese, Akira Kurosawa, Ingmar Bergman, Stanley Kubrick, and with the most, tied with 7 apiece, are Alfred Hitchcock and Steven Spielberg. I think Spielberg is of particular note because he notably has 0 films on the Sight and Sound critics list, but he's being repped very hard by the audience side of things. But moving on to the final list, I didn't write it down, but you can find the list on Letterboxd in the link below. But let's break it down a bit. In terms of points, the films range from 405.25 points for the #1 film and 79.625 points for the #100 film. And that means that with the point values how they are, the top 20 films from both the Sight and Sound critics and directors list automatically make it on there. However, 12 of those films are shared between the 2 lists. And overall, the 2 lists share 70 of the same films between them. But it also means that the top film on all the other lists does not have enough points on its own to qualify. The final list features 8 directors with at least 3 films featured: Steven Spielberg, Christopher Nolan, Stanley Kubrick, Akira Kurosawa, Alfred Hitchcock, Andrei Tarkovsky, Peter Jackson, and Francis Ford Coppola. The most recent films to appear on the list are Parasite and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, both from 2019, while the oldest film to feature is Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans from 1927, and in total there are 4 silent films that make it onto the final list. In total, 80 films from my previous list make it onto the new list, with the highest debut being Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, all the way at number 12, while the highest to fall off is Buster Keaton's The General at number 37. Don't be a Confederate. These are the 20 films that got added onto the final list, while these are the 20 films that fell off. Let's bid them farewell. This is the final list broken down by decade, with the 60s once again having the highest number of films represented, this time with 18. Previously it was tied with the 1950s, but that has fallen down to 3rd place, while the 90s have gone up to 2nd place with a very strong showing of 16 films. There are no films from this current decade, and no films from before the 1920s. Alright, so What else? Most featured actor, it's Harrison Ford. He has 5 films on the final list. What about composer? It's John Williams and Howard Shore, tied with 5 films apiece as well. Hey guys, come here for a second. Is this anything? Is there a point to any of this? I mean, film is such a subjective experience. We all relate to things and react to things and respond to things in so many different ways based on our lives and who we are. How can we expect to quantify and rank every little thing objectively? There are so many of my favorite films that don't appear on this list, and there are films that do appear on the list that I don't even like. So what's the point of pitting these films against each other and constantly turning art into some kind of competition? I mean, is this right? Trick question, of course it's right. This list is scientifically accurate. Here is the definitive top 10 films of all time. And here you are, the top 10. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these films, but first I want to mention that there were 4 films from the previous list that fell out of the top 10. Schindler's List, Psycho, The Passion of Joan of Arc, and Persona, which just missed, coming in at number 11. Starting off at number 10 is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, keeping Hitchcock there in the top 10. I think this film, maybe more than any other film I've seen, benefits from repeat viewings. The first time I saw it, I liked it. The second time, I loved it. And the third, I recognized it as one of the greatest films I'd ever seen. The way the obsession and the paranoia just gets under your skin, it's incredible. I think the drama and the tension that Hitchcock is able to build throughout this film is pretty much unparalleled, and just some of the most striking imagery you're ever going to see. Her in the green dress and that red room is unparalleled imagery. It's phenomenal. And number 9 is Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story. I mean, you have some of the most beautifully framed images you're ever going to see in a movie, and just its contemplativeness and the atmosphere that it wraps you up in is really phenomenal. And there's a quote in the film that I think about all the time, and it's, isn't life disappointing? It's this conversation these two women are having, and it's not just the quote, but it's the context and the way she delivers it, because it's not full of despair. It's just a fact that you kind of have to deal with and live with. Life disappoints. It's always going to. That is a constant, but you have to acknowledge that and move forward. And it's just a brilliant moment in the film, and just that one line is just, I mean, forever in my brain. And number 8 is Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love. I don't know if there is a more evocative, atmospheric movie out there in the world. Just some of these images, the smoke and the colors, it is phenomenal. And people talk about how films today have become so sexless. And I think In the Mood for Love is a great example of, it's not just about explicit sexuality, it's about passion and chemistry coming off the screen. Because In the Mood for Love is a PG movie. There's nothing explicit about it, but it is one of the sexiest films you're ever going to see in your life. And just being a forbidden romance kind of movie, it is maybe the best there is. It is phenomenal. The chemistry, the tension, the longing, the passion, I mean, it is just coming out of the screen. It is phenomenal. And number 7 is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Obviously, technically flawless, impeccable, it's incredible. And one of the things I've really come to appreciate about it is the way it ties technology with our destruction and our ability to harm each other, because you go from the ape man and the bone and learning how to use that as a weapon to kill the other ape man, to HAL 9000 and this machine we're going to use to, you know, be more convenient in space travel, and it has the capacity to murder those people. And I think that's something true through the ages with technology. From the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, we got better at killing each other. You know, every bit of advancement in those kind of technologies, whether it's catapults or combustion, we find ways to make it easier for us to kill ourselves and each other and to bring about our destruction. And how technology and that violence is linked, I think the way that 2001 makes you think about that is really fascinating. And there's just so much that it makes you think about in terms of who we are, our place in the universe, and what we're doing, you know, in terms of progress and advancement and exploration, and what it's all for and what we're trying to find. I think it's just, you know, an incredible film. And number 6 is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. And I think looking back at this film, it is still so clear and evident just what a sea change this movie was. The amount of innovation, not just technically, but structurally in this film, I mean, it's mind-blowing to watch it in context. It still feels so modern today, and just obviously all the themes, you know, dealing with this kind of person, this kind of mogul, it's just as applicable today as it was in the 1940s, coming out of the Great Depression. I think it is a fantastic examination of greed, of obsession, of that constant need to fill those holes and prove yourself, that you see from people like Charles Foster Kane in the real world. Brilliant on every single level. And number 5 is The Godfather Part 2. One thing about this film that I have really, really grown to appreciate more and more and more as the years have gone on is John Cazale's performance. He is so brilliant in this film. The scene where Michael is telling him he's essentially out of the family, I mean, it is such a wonderful and heartbreaking performance that, you know, he kind of gets overshadowed by Pacino, by De Niro in the movie. But it's that moment, I think, more than just about any in the film that I like to revisit and think about. Because it's really so fantastic. The angles, the chair, just the way he's performing. I mean, it's really, really brilliant and so sad and wonderful. But the film overall is obviously fantastic. The way it mirrors Vito and Michael is really brilliant. It's a really wonderful touch, and it loses none of the stylistic or atmospheric panache of the first one. And number 4 is Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Now, obviously, technically, it's impeccable. The shots, the editing, the music, everything is fantastic. But one of the things that really sticks with me about the film, and there's a line that talks about how these are blue-collar guys who are just looking to kind of make their way in the world. These are guys who just didn't want to be under the thumb of some of that like corporate drudgery and making a life of their own, but they weren't going to sit there and take it from, you know, some corporate stooge. And so these are people who are out there making a world and a community and a life for themselves on their own terms and in their own way. And that comes up a lot, and, you know, with Henry not wanting to kind of be like his dad. You know, he's making more money than his father at 15, you know, by working with these people. He's not going to live that kind of way. He's not just going to constantly be scraping by. And so I think the film, as a critique of capitalism and the way that people turn towards crime as a response to capitalism and as a response to the kind of oppression that you have to live under if you're a working class person. And I think it's something that kind of gets a little overlooked in the face of some of the more, you know, spectacular, you know, kind of things that happen throughout the film. But the world it puts you in, from the sort of warmth and community that you get at the beginning of the film, and to the sort of paranoia and the unhinged and everything falling apart as you move along, and as he kind of digs in deeper and keeps kind of going for more and more and more. I think it's really, really brilliant the way the film does that and the way it handles it. And number 3 is Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. When you go through this film and you're just kind of in that hell of the jungle, and there's all of this fear and tension and uncertainty of what's going to be, you know, around the bend in the river, and what's going to come out of the jungle, and what's going to happen. And when you finally get to Marlon Brando, and there, I mean, what, you know, people call it a star turn. I think that's what Orson Welles called it. When you have this, you know, huge actor in this role, and he doesn't show up until, you know, 3/4 of the way through the film. The way it pays off in Apocalypse Now, the control he has over the screen, it is unbelievable. His speech, you know, the horror, I mean, God, it is so good. The way the film builds to that moment and pays off in that moment, unbelievable. And number 2 is Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. The way it deconstructs and examines what being a hero means is really, really fascinating. In a lot of ways, it confronts the selfishness of heroism and puts it into an interesting perspective and an interesting light, while being one of the most fantastically spectacular action films you're ever going to see. The final fights, the way Akira Kurosawa moves these crowds and these groups of people through the screen, horses running, the rain coming down, arrows flying, swords clashing, it all moves together so beautifully. It is like a flowing river the whole way. Everything is perfect in its framing, in the continuity, in the spatial continuity. You always know exactly what's going on, where it's happening. His control over that space is like nothing I've ever seen, and it's like nothing I think that has been put on the screen since. It is that perfect in this film. And of course you've got what I think is Toshiro Mifune's best performances, one of the greatest performances of all time, in one of my favorite characters of all time, Kikuchio. He is phenomenal. The heart he brings, the passion, the intensity. He is the anchor of that film, and it's part of what separates Seven Samurai from its remakes, and is just that character and the way he brings so much heart into the film. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. And at number one, once again, is The Godfather. Again, by a incredible margin. The Godfather with 405.25 points. Seven Samurai, 321.25. A massive gap between the two once again. And with it being so dominant on both these lists, there's really no consensus you can come to other than The Godfather when you're looking at both critical and, you know, audience sentiment. There's just no other film that compares. There's no other film that can compete. And so I've been thinking about what is it about The Godfather that does it. I mean, you've got this epic story, there's crime and violence and blood and people fighting, there's drama and romance and sexuality, there's so much introspection about who we are and what we do and the American dream and capitalism, you know, the same sort of things explored in Goodfellas. While being, on a technical level, one of the most brilliant films ever made. The lighting in this film, the cinematography, it feels so warm, it's so beautiful, the contrasts are fantastic. One of the most memorable scores you're ever going to hear. And on a performance level, maybe one of the greatest ensembles ever put together. There's not a bad performance from anybody in the film, whether it's your main characters with Al Pacino and Marlon Brando, or some of your side characters, Luca Brasi, or some of the other mob bosses. I mean, everybody is at the top of their game. Everybody is firing on all cylinders. And I will say, The Godfather, I definitely prefer it to Godfather 2, even though I love that film as well. And for me, it's Michael and the journey he goes on in this film and his character arc. He goes from the kid who's going to get out of that life of crime, who is going to be respectable and honest, and, you know, Governor Corleone, Senator Corleone, that was his dream for Michael, and the way he goes from that into, you know, being enveloped in the family business and sort of that fatalism that came with it. I mean, it's brilliant. It's such a wonderful trajectory, and the way Al Pacino plays it, the character arc you see him go through in his performance, unbelievable. It's amazing, and so I just think he is so fantastic in this movie, and just the movie on the whole is obviously amazing. And there you have it, the top 10 films out of the 100 definitive, ultimate, without question, 100 greatest films of all time. And with my mission complete, I return to the wilderness, to wander the earth until I am called upon again to answer life's mysteries. Until that time comes, farewell.